Welcome to session 10 of Archaeology in the Bible. This is the second of our bonus episodes and also the last session that we will have in the course. So back in session 4, we did talk about the Exodus and the conquest, but with some discussions, we decided to go a little bit deeper in this particular time frame. So let's get a little bit deeper into the Exodus, and let's start it off with a question that is often asked, especially by skeptics and minimalists: was there an Exodus? So again, in session 4, we looked at some supporting information. There is a significant lack of historical evidence, or at least the kind of historical evidence that we like to see in modern times. We do know that there was a relationship between Egypt and the Levant that went back a great deal of time. We see uh, evidence of Asiatics who traded with Egypt at various times. We know about the Hyksos and the expulsion of the Hyksos, who were a Semitic people who actually took over uh, Upper Egypt at the time. Um, excuse me, Lower Egypt. We do know that there was a significant amount of Semitic slavery in Egypt. And then we also have some of the cultural specificities where we see some information that corroborates the accounts of brick making in the book of Exodus. However, there's no inscription, no monument or anything from the Egyptians that says the God of our slaves destroyed our infrastructure and our king, so we let them go. And in most cases, that's the kind of evidence that people are going to be looking for before they really are firm in the fact that the Exodus actually occurred. We also have to look at the fact that in many cases, minimalists may take that approach of minimalism purely due to a hostility to the biblical text. Many things that they might accept as being historical from other texts that have significant religious content, they will reject out of hand for anything with a Jewish or a Christian context. But we have had several efforts over the years to have corroborating information. There's been a great deal of effort to point to one thing or another that says yes, this proves the Exodus. And so let's look at a couple of those. We have the Pure Papyrus. This is a papyrus that was discovered in 1828. It is currently in the Museum of Leiden in the Netherlands, and it is one of the most common examples of something that people will point to as evidence of the Exodus. The papyrus is actually quite lengthy, but it talks about a time in Egyptian history of great turmoil, and some of the descriptions it uses. It talks about a pestilence throughout the land. It says that the river became blood. It describes a really odd turn of fortunes where wealth comes into the hands of servants, and it even talks about the fact that servants run away. So, some form of parallel there of the Exodus story of the Israelites taking wealth from the Egyptians as they were leaving. It specifically says the cattle moan because of the state of the land, and one of the plagues was a disease of livestock. Talks about destruction of crops, which of course we have various aspects. We have the locusts, and we also have the plague of hail. And then it says that there is no light in the land, which, of course, there was a plague of darkness as well. So there are a lot of things that kind of match up fairly well with this, which would be why you see lots of folks pointing to this. But there are some fairly significant differences. It does have the comment that the tribes of the desert have become Egyptians. And it also says the barbarians from abroad have come to Egypt, and the desert dwellers are skilled in the arts of the Delta. So, from a historical standpoint, it almost seems like they're talking about the Hyksos invasion, maybe more so than the Exodus. And there are a few scholars out there who will say that they believe that the expulsion of the Hyksos is the foundation for the Exodus account. Some similarities, some not so similar. Really a lack of consensus on this. So some very interesting similarities, but some fairly key differences as well. So not definitive, not something that you're going to hand to a minimalist and convince them. We also have the El Arish inscription. It has also been used as a reference to prove the Exodus. The inscription was found in the late 1880s or in the late 1800s, where this particular stone was being used as a cattle feeding trough. Inscribed on the stone is an account of a pharaoh who was fighting evildoers and then leaps into a whirlpool. So we have the parallel there with the pharaoh of the Exodus who is drowned when the Red Sea drops in on the army as they try to cross through it. So there are many apologists who have tried to find additional parallels in some of the place names that are inscribed on here. The evidence is pretty sketchy at best. The inscription basically has the pharaoh winning the contest, so that's not quite what we know from the Exodus account of the Bible. And it also has this pharaoh who's jumping into the whirlpool. It doesn't have him dying. It has him turning into a being with the legs of a crocodile, the head of a hawk that has bull's horns. So, and then in the few cases where where some of the proponents will try to tell you that there are similar place names to the time of the Exodus. The El Arish inscription has about 4 or 5 different stories on it. So they're actually pulling place names from a story that has nothing to do with the pharaoh leaping into the whirlpool. So the evidence isn't really compelling, and people really make a press. This is again one of those points that I would caution everyone on, that we can't make these huge stretches and strains with the evidence to try and support the historicity of the Bible. It's either there or it isn't, and we certainly can't support that with shoddy academic work and questionable evidence. So let's take it as an element of faith then that there was an Exodus. So then we come to the question of when was the Exodus? Well, there's no consensus there either. You have the early date, which is 1446 BC. You have a middle date, which can vary anywhere from about 1406 to about 1386 BC. Not a huge range there, but still a range. And then you have the late date, which is 1250 BC, which is pretty significant. So you may ask yourself, why is there such a spread in dates? Well, you'll recall back in a previous session, we talked about the differences in the biblical text. We had the Masoretic text, which is a Hebrew rendering of the Old Testament. The earliest example we have of the Masoretic text is from 1000 A.D. Not to say that was when it was first formulated or when it was first written down, but that is the earliest version we have of it that we can study. We also have the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew texts of the day, and we believe it came about sometime in about 200 or 300 BC. The earliest example we have of Septuagint to study is the Codex Sinaiticus from 325 AD. And the challenge we have is when we read the Masoretic text and we read the Septuagint, they give us different numbers. So here in First Kings chapter 6, verse 1, and this particular translation is the English Standard Version. It says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So essentially what we have here is this particular passage tells us that from the time that Solomon started to build the temple, if you count back 480 years, that is when the people of Israel left Egypt. So that is when the Exodus began. So this is the English Standard Version, which many or actually most of the English Bible translations, especially the ones that are from the Protestant traditions, come from the Masoretic text, because the feeling is that a Hebrew text is going to be more authentic. However, if you come to this is an English translation of the Septuagint, of the same passage. It says, and it came to pass in the 440th year after the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt, in the 4th year and 2nd month of the reign of Solomon over Israel, that the king commanded that they should take great and costly stones for the foundation of the house, and hewn stones. So there we have it. We have two different numbers coming here. So let's do a little bit of quick math. The expectation or the estimate of when the first temple was built by Solomon, scholars will argue about that a little bit. But if you kind of want to shoot the middle of the estimates, it's probably right around 966 BC, based on some dating that's been done, and some of the stuff from the Bible itself. So if we take the Masoretic text, 966 BC, counting back 480 years, that's our 1446 BC date, the early date of the Exodus. And likewise with the Septuagint, starting out in 966 and going out 440, that gives us the 1406 date of the Exodus. So that's the middle date. So again, we had the early date and we had the middle date, but there was one more. There was the late date, and that comes from yet another alternate interpretation. Now, this time we're going to figure it in reverse. The 480 years in the Masoretic text is considered to be symbolic of 12 40-year generations. So 480, 12 generations of 40 years equals 480. So that is the symbolic number of a generation. However, if we assume that a generation is the time of birth of a child, so basically 25 years, that the parent or the father would be about 25 when the child was born. If you multiply that same 12 generations times 25, that gives you 300. And so if you use 300 years from 966 BC, you get approximately 1250 BC, which is that date of the late Exodus. So you may ask yourself, why on earth are we going through all this mental gymnastics of, 25-year generations versus 40-year generations? What on earth do we feel the need to do that for? Well, there's an additional part of the text from Exodus, and it's Exodus chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. It says, therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So what we have here is the mention of a city called Ramesses, and that has led a number of scholars to assume that this city must not have been there until the rule of one of the pharaohs named Ramesses, which is much later than these early and middle dates. The Ramessian pharaohs were more in the 13th century, the 1200s BC, and so That's why a lot of scholars are gonna come down on the side of the late date for the Exodus. However, because we can't just make this easy, um, if you look in Genesis 47:11, during the time of Joseph, it specifically says that Joseph settled his family in the land of Ramesses. And we know that Joseph was probably at least 100 to 150 years, maybe even more, before the time of the Exodus. And that was way before the time of the Ramessean pharaohs. So, the more conservative scholars will tell you that they believe that probably there was just a region of Egypt that was called Ramses and had been called that for a long time, and that may have been where the Ramessean pharaohs actually took their name. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that, and we talked about this a little bit in terms of the manuscripts. This could have been a case where a later scribe who was copying down the biblical account knew that in the current day that area was called Ramesses, and that their audience or their readership would know it by that name, so they would change it from the old name to the more new, modern, updated name. Those are all possibilities, and so you can argue that to your heart's content. Now, we have other issues because it's never just as easy as that. We have the issue of the length of the sojourn in Egypt. How long were the Israelites in Egypt? And this again hinges on a difference in the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. The Masoretic text says that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. That's what it says. And so the Septuagint says that it gives you that same 430-year time frame, but it specifically says rather than the children of Israel were in Egypt, it says the children of Israel were in Canaan and Egypt. And so a lot of the scholars who accept the Septuagint will kind of split that down the middle and say they probably spent about 200 to 215 years in Canaan and about 200 to 215 years in Egypt. Now, why does this matter that much? Well, it becomes problematic when you start trying to count backwards from kind of known events. If they're in Egypt for 400 years, then that puts you in one chronology. If they were in Egypt for 200 years, that puts you in a different chronology, and so that throws a real monkey wrench into things. The fact, and we talked about patriarchal lifespans before, whether those are honorific ages or whether people actually lived hundreds and hundreds of years. That also complicates the matter somewhat when you're trying to count backwards in these kind of things. So it makes the reckoning very, very messy. And the other part that really becomes quite messy is nothing seems to line up with some of the certain things, the things that we do know for sure. We can't get some of the archaeology to line up. We have people uh, supposedly being alive at a time when cities that they were to have visited in the biblical account didn't exist. So that's very problematic. A last thing to kind of throw a monkey wrench into the matter is the timing of the destruction of Sodom. Now, we spent last session talking about whether perhaps Tel El Hammam is Sodom. We're going to take that as a matter of faith, just so that we can have a hard date to pin to something. The carbon 14 dating gives us a pretty hard and fast date of 1700 BC for the destruction event at Tel El Hammam. So if we assume that is Sodom and we assume that Abraham was there to see it, then there is really no way that any of this standard chronology type stuff works, and we have to kind of work around it. And so uh, when that becomes at issue, then you're left with the question not only of when did the Exodus occur, but who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, You might ask, if you ask 5 scholars, you're going to get 6 different opinions. And really, we all know that this is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Ramesses II, better known as Yul Brynner from the movie The Ten Commandments. So you see that Cecil B. DeMille in his movie went with the standard scholar opinion that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramesses II, which means you are looking at a late date of the Exodus. A lot of things don't line up there, and that kind of messes up all the Book of Judges and the conquest and everything else. So quite a few issues there. So let's back up from this. Even though Yul Brynner made a heck of a pharaoh, the voice alone just really did it. But let's back up from that and let's see what we can learn. And remember, we talked about historical synchronisms. We have a historical progression, and where can we find places that it crosses over with another history. So let's talk about the synchronisms of the Exodus without counting years. Let's just look at the effects. Let's look at the effect of the plagues. You have all these plagues. Some of them were nuisance plagues, frogs and lice, but quite a few of these plagues were harshly economic in nature. The pestilence of the livestock would have made a huge impact on the Egyptian economy. The hail and the locusts would have completely destroyed the crops. Again, we're not accustomed to thinking about things from an agricultural standpoint, but with the loss of crops like that, the famine would have been widespread. There would have been wide death, and so that would have been a key noteworthy thing. Obviously, the loss of the firstborn would have had a huge impact on the population. Also, let's look at it from a standpoint if the nation of Israel, or if the children of Israel were such a large group and they were the slave labor that was making things happen in Egypt, if they just pick up and leave, that's also going to have an enormous economic and societal impact to the Egyptian nation. Also, the Exodus account tells us that Pharaoh and his entire army were killed when the Red Sea collapsed in on them. So, if you lose the Pharaoh and you lose a significant portion of the army, that's going to be a major crisis in leadership, both politically and religiously and economically, all the way across the board. So if all of these things happen within the span of a month or two, or a couple of months, we're going to see a fairly significant situation. Probably, what nation could shoulder all these things happening pretty much simultaneously? We're going to look for some sort of sign of Egyptian collapse, or some point in time where it seems like Egypt has been harshly affected by these types of events. Again, we know that if the Egyptians are noteworthy for their propaganda. So the fact that we don't see a monument that says all these terrible things happened to us and we let the slaves go shouldn't be terribly surprising. But we should be able to maybe do a little detective work and see some things. So we're going to look at a series of maps, and that's going to take us through a whirlwind tour of a few hundred years of Egyptian history. And let's see if we can find some sort of a sudden change that fits these kind of synchronisms from the Exodus. So let's start at the time of the Hyksos. We know that the Hyksos were a Semitic people from the area of Canaan and the Levant, and maybe even a little bit further east than there. They came in and took control of Lower Egypt right around 1850 BC. The Upper Egypt, which is shown here as Theban Egypt, remained in the hands of native Egyptians, but the Hyksos exercised control over Lower Egypt, which was the Nile Delta, which was the wealthy, productive portion of Egypt. So this would have been a time frame that would have been very difficult for the Egyptians. This is it's funny when you look at the Egyptian culture, because a lot of scholars will tell you that it's hard to see the difference there. This is very similar to what you see many years later with the Roman Empire and the Germanic barbarians. The barbarians didn't come to destroy the empire. They came to try and be a part of it. They wanted to, when the barbarians came into the empire, they usually tried to act like Romans. And that's what happened here with the Hyksos as well. In many cases, they adopted many of the Egyptian customs. They dressed like the former Egyptian pharaohs. They renamed themselves. They tried to speak Egyptian, all those sorts of things. And so, what you see here is you have the power ranking numbers. These are all the major powers in the ancient Near East at the time. So you see that the Hyksos were a very well developed military power. So they are number one. They are the premier power in the area. Mitanni, which is kind of in that northern portion there of Mesopotamia, going up into the mountains. They are number two. Hatti, the Hittite Empire, is number three. Theban Egypt, the remnants of the native Egyptians, is number four, and then you have Assyria, who is they will grow to be a world power, but that's not going to be for several hundred years at this point. So the Hyksos, you note, are in control of the Nile Delta, but because they come from the Levant, from the Canaan area, they also exercise some level of control over Canaan as well. We generally assume, if you'll recall from our earlier sessions, we generally assume that this is a nice synchronism time for Joseph to have been in Egypt. It makes a lot of sense that Joseph would have had the kind of success he did in dealing with a pharaoh who also happened to be Semitic, just like him. So, but it didn't last. You have the rise of Amosis, who drove the Hyksos out of Egypt back into the Canaan area and even pursued them into Canaan. He really begins to push and consolidate the Egyptian nation and really works at strengthening the nation. So you see there that they've gone from being number four to number two with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And so Amosis is gonna push very hard in that case. Again, from the synchronism standpoint, we kind of considered this to be that stage in Exodus that Amosis could very well have been the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. So as we see this progressing, this is going to be about 1550 BC. So we move on from there. The house of Amosis, we have his son Tutmosis. Well, he's really his successor, his adopted son, Tutmosis the first. And Tutmosis begins to really press to expand the Egyptian empire, starts pushing into Canaan and Syria, even as far as the Euphrates. So you see this kind of shading here. He's actually pushed into past the Sinai here, and as far as the Euphrates, you see here. This is a time of intense conflict, lots of warfare, and this is also the time that archaeology shows us a significant amount of slave raids, and during the military expeditions, a large number of slaves are pulled in from the Canaan area into Egypt. So much so that it affects the population numbers of Canaan for centuries. the reduction by as much as half to even three-quarters of a reduction in population from pre-war timeframes. And you see here now in our power rankings that the Egyptians are number one. They are the premier power, really, and are starting to pull away from everyone else. They are the big kid on the block. So we continue on, and we have a ruler or two, and then we find ourselves with Tutmosis III in about 1458 BC. Egypt is becoming stronger and stronger. They have it's interesting that Tutmosis actually his mother Hatshepsut was the regent and ruling the nation of Egypt for a while, basically as pharaoh. And it seems like once he came of age, she didn't really want to let go of the power. So some scholars say that he actually had her killed and took control at about age 25. But Tutmosis was a great military leader. Not only did he, previously Tutmosis the first had some expeditions into Canaan. Tutmosis III really solidified his control over the area, and it becomes an Egyptian possession. He's extracting great amounts of wealth and resources. So there's lots of tribute and taxes coming out of there, and additionally, even more slaves. So then we come to Tutmosis IV, his successor, and here we start to see a little diplomacy. The military aspect's still going on. Tutmosis ruled began in about 1397 or so in time frame. It's hard to date in the chronology sometimes, but Tutmosis IV was also a well-known military leader. Expanded the influence of the Egyptian empire. But one of the key things he's noted for is he made a treaty with Mitanni, which was the number two power, and that completely changed the power dynamics of the entire ancient Near East and really put Egypt in an unassailable position. It really cemented their position as the premier power in the area. So then about 1390-ish or so, we see the accession of Amenhotep III. Thutmosis IV dies young, and Amenhotep III, his son, comes to the throne at age 12. So he's essentially his mother and his wife rule on his behalf, and at that point in early in Amenhotep III's rule, we see Hatti, who had been smarting over the fact that they were left out of the whole Egypt Mitanni alliance. Hatti attacks Mitanni. The Hittite Empire attacks Mitanni and decisively defeats them. And one of the things that's really interesting in this regard is, despite the alliance, Egypt doesn't help them. And we start to see some pretty significant evidence in the archaeology that the Egyptian presence in Canaan decreases significantly during this time frame as well. So for whatever reason, Egypt has pulled back from a lot of their imperial possessions, and they have failed to assist their ally Mitanni in the war against the Hittites. And also, we start to see once this kind of activity is going on, once the Hittites are doing this, we see that Egypt's power ranking starts to really decline. Now, at this point, we have the Amenhotep IV comes to the throne, and he changes his name to Akhenaten because he founds a monotheistic religion that worships the sun disk. This doesn't go over very well at all with the traditional Egyptians. And there's lots of question of why he's suddenly gone to a monotheistic religion, but we don't have any real solid evidence of why. But we do know that during this time frame of Akhenaten, the Hittite Empire expands drastically. They've basically completely wiped out the Mitanni, and the Hatti start to expand into portions of Canaan and the Levant that were previously Egyptian controlled. Egypt's power has diminished significantly. This is the time frame during the reign of Akhenaten that we have the Amarna tablets, which you'll recall a lot of those tablets were the Canaan rulers asking for assistance from the Egyptian pharaoh and seemingly not getting it. So we start to see real decline in Egypt. They're still number three, but they're number three now because there is no number four. So then Akhenaten's son, when Akhenaten dies, Akhenaten's son Tutankhamun, we've heard of him, when he comes to the throne at a very young age, he completely gets rid of this worship of the sun and goes back to the old religion. But Tutankhamun seemed to have some health issues, and when you consider that the various pharaonic families were very much interbred, I think there were a lot of genetic issues there. So Tut dies young, and out of a feeling of helplessness, his widow makes a plea to the Hittite king to send one of his sons to Egypt for her to marry, so that she can maintain the power of the throne. So that doesn't go over very well, and so there's a coup. A bunch of army generals seize the throne. They murder the Hittite prince who has come to town to marry the wife of Tutankhamun. Well, we assume they murdered him. Nobody else really seemed to have cause for it. But at this point, the generals take over, specifically one named Horemheb, and he rules for about 28 years. And they start to turn things around. They seize the throne, and then they begin to rebuild the Egyptian power. So you can see here that Egypt is on the rise. The power rankings number two. Then you can see that rather than they start to just as my professor likes to say, they start to name their old army buddies as the next pharaoh. So you have a series of generals, and then you have Ramesses the First, whose son Seti has a lot of success. And then eventually the son of Seti is Ramesses II, who is known as the Great. And Ramesses II ruled for 66 years. He was reported to have been over 90 years old when he died. Some of his sons actually died waiting to take power because he lived so long. So Ramesses the Great, he expanded Egyptian power, started to push back into the Levant, which put him into conflict with the Hittite Empire. There's a key battle at Kadesh that's one of the greatest of the ancient world's battles. Kind of fought the Hittites to a draw. But so this ends up kind of being the end of that time frame. So we move from early to middle to late Exodus dates there. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, which one of these guys is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, let's go to the chart here. We can look at Ahmosis, and he's kind of building things, and Amenhotep the first, and so forth. But you can see at about the time of Tutmosis the third and Amenhotep the second, the power of Egypt is growing, and it comes to a height with Tutmosis the fourth. Egypt is the number one power, and they've also made a diplomatic agreement with the Mitanni Empire. So things are great. And then all of a sudden, in the time frame of Amenhotep III, it all goes south. Egypt falls from grace. They start to pull their army out of Canaan. They lose control, and then by the time of Akhenaten, the protectorate, the rulers of Canaan are pleading with the Pharaoh to send troops to help them against bandits and so forth. So it seems like Tutmosis the fourth is the most likely candidate as Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, don't want to leave you with just that as a synchronism. Another thing that makes this very interesting is if you look at the time of Tutmosis, and then you add 40 years to it in the time of Akhenaten, you have the time that should be the Israelite conquest. And interestingly enough, we know from the book of Joshua, it talks about Canaan being a land of the Ammonites and the Hittites, and this is a time frame when there actually was a Hittite presence in the northern portion of Canaan. So that's kind of interesting. But what we also know is that during this time frame of Akhenaten, Egypt has basically completely pulled their army out of Canaan, which seems to be a really nice coincidence if you are the children of Israel coming into Canaan and wanting to start taking some of the land, because the Egyptian army would have made that very difficult. Plus, you also look at the fact that for all those years of Egyptian hegemony, where they were basically weakening the land of Canaan by years of tribute and slave raids and so forth, this also puts Canaan in a standpoint that is very advantageous for the Israelites to go into the conquest. As we mentioned before, this is the time of the Amarna tablets. And you'll recall when we talked about the Amarna tablets in session 4, many of the Canaanite rulers were pleading with the Pharaoh, Akhenaten, to send troops to help them against the dreaded Habaru. Again, is that a definitive thing that's the Hebrews, that's the Israelites? Not completely definitive, but boy, it all lines up kind of interesting, doesn't it? And we know too, um, just from the repeated pleas in the Amarna tablets over the years that we have recorded, the Egyptians didn't send any help, and so that kind of puts us in the standpoint that we can see. All right, so that finishes up our discussion of synchronisms of the Exodus. Again, let's talk a little bit about references. The Harvest Handbook of Bible Lands is definitely a very great reference. Like I said, it's got lots of illustrations. I'm kind of a picture guy, so definitely appreciate that. Then, if you want to get really into the depth of the synchronisms themselves, I would highly recommend "Let My People Go" by Dr. Steve Collins. He goes through in some detail a number of the synchronisms we talked about here. And then our old standard of all things of the Old Testament on the reliability of the Old Testament by Kenneth Kitchen goes into a pretty significant amount of detail. Funny enough, you'll see two different viewpoints here: the Harvest Handbook of the Bible Lands and Let My People Go. Of course, both have the involvement of Dr. Collins. Dr. Collins is a proponent of the middle Exodus date. Dr. Kitchen is a proponent of the late Exodus date. So you will see, some evidences from each of them in those two different resources. So And now we come to the end of the session and of the course. Appreciate your attention.